two fabulous summers in the 90s, partly because my wife, Laurie Stahlbrand, was the host of the CBC morning show, and partially because I was working on a biography of Neil Reimer, who some of you may recall, one of the great social justice workers of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Neil's daughter was the mayor of the city for a period of time, and he also was a great, very much in love with the city, and he taught me to understand and respect the city, which I did. And I'm happy to come back, and now I think what I can see, which you may not be able to see as an insider, but what hits any outsider, is that Edmonton is at the tipping point of becoming, I believe, at least has the ability to be at the tipping point of North American cities in terms of moving towards a comprehensive food agenda. So if you look through the checklist of what you need to be at the tipping point, it would be you need to have lots of festivals, because when people go to festivals, they like to eat on the street, they like a vibrant street food scene. You also need to have a lot of festivals because you need a lot of creatives to make a food movement really hum, and there's a lot of creative people here in Edmonton. You need a lot of young people. I would say fundamentally the youth and the food movement are almost one across most of the world. You got 2 universities and a number of other colleges, so you're qualifying there. You need an active NGO sector, which you have. You need a responsive city. Well, I think probably certainly in the whole field of what used to be called waste management, and Edmonton has helped get redefined as resource management. This city has been in the lead for well over 20 years and is now moving ahead now on compost. And the city planners have been right at the forefront of trying to move this agenda. You need to be a multicultural city, which you are in spades. You need to have hospitals that have some understanding of food. And I came here about 5 years ago to give a talk at the University Hospitals program, which to the best of my knowledge were the first hospitals in Canada to take food seriously as an issue. You need to have bloggers and writers. You got Jennifer Cockrell-King, who's just written a fabulous book on city food, and you got a number of very prominent bloggers. And you need farmland, as the councillor mentioned, and you need the whole family to get into whole food. And so my message is you're at the tipping point, so tonight when you're at a restaurant, be a generous tipper. So I have, if you don't like lousy jokes, you're not going to be happy with my presentation. My presentation is divided into 3 parts. And the first part, I'm about to celebrate my 50th anniversary as an activist. So I'm going to share a few points of what I've learned on how to survive. And the second part, I'm going to talk about what it is that food can do for the city. And the third part is what city can do for food. And so my main message is that we're working on a 2-way street here. The city has a lot to learn about food and what it can do, but people who are real keen about food also have to learn a lot about the city and what it needs. And so when we get those two humming, that's when we cross the tipping point. And my message there, I'm trying to basically change the conversation that we normally have in North America about food, which is basically a worrisome conversation. Are we eating too much fat, too many calories? We got this problem or that problem. And I'm trying to help people see that food is fundamentally a good news story that can help us do things we have not been able to do before. So that's fundamentally what food can do for the city. I think it's changed the way we see things. And likewise, I think what the city can do is to use food to solve some problems they haven't been able to solve before. So first, my personal advice, stay away from that. You have a great beer here in Edmonton. And the interesting thing about craft beer is how quickly it's moved in the marketplace over 10 years. You've got very small, independent, family-run businesses, virtually no advertising budget, up against two of the biggest monopolies in the world, the two giant beer monopolies, and they are beating them. Okay, that's the only sector of beer that is moving is the craft beer industry, and they've now got 10% of the market. So that'll give you a little gauge of how things are moving and how quickly they're moving. Now, beer is actually, you may not be too surprised to know, is moving faster than the food movement as a whole. But when I started to get active in food, which was in 1991, the amount of organic food that was sold commercially, if you take organic as a bit of a marker, especially at that time of what alternative kind of food would be, was 0.1% of the market. Okay, in 2001, a year after I started my job, it was 1.4% of the market across North America. And now it is just broken from last year at 4.4. If you add together formally organic, informally organic, local, sustainable, something, like fair trade, animal welfare, you're up in the sort of 8 to 10% area. So it's about close on the heels of beer. And but I give you that figure for two reasons. One is to know we have come a very long way in a pretty short order of time from a historian's point of view. And two is we need to know how far we have to go. Like 10% is still a fair distance away from 50%, a fair way away from 100%. So one thing I'd like to just say about framing, which I think is really important, that people have framing right when they are trying to move a cause. Jennifer, whose book I mentioned to you, I really admire. The only thing I don't like about it is the title. And it's called Food in the City, and it's called Urban Agriculture and the New Food Revolution. And a lot of us are so enthusiastic about food that we use the word revolution a bit too lightly. And there's a couple of problems with calling it a revolution, especially around city policy conversations. Number one, on a factual level, 10% is not a revolution. And number two, on a program level, or on a strategic level, in the field of innovation, there's a thing known as the adjacent possible. That is, before humans developed fingers, they had to have arms. Before they developed arms, they had to be standing erect, otherwise you'd have 4 legs. So you can only move when some things are in place. And the reason we don't have any local and sustainable beers in Canada, we have craft beers, but not local and sustainable, is because we don't have the infrastructure for charring the barley, and we don't have the farmers who are growing the hops. We're a couple of years away from that. But until the adjacent possibles are in place, you can't move. So we don't want to talk about the revolution until we put a lot of things in place, like city policies, for one example. So it misstates where we are. And the third is, I think, in terms of where our energy level is, I hope I don't sound too old in saying this, but Wendell Berry, who's one of the great old men of the food movement, said, what we need to learn today is how to be patient at a time of emergency. So my third problem with calling it a revolution is we need to learn actually how to be centered and calm in a very difficult area, because just because the world's problems are urgent does not mean that somebody's going to learn faster or going to learn easier if you yell at them. So we need to sort of get our perspective right. The second point comes from Jack Layton, who many of you have followed what's happened with him over the last period of time. And he's, of course, most famous for the statement he made on his deathbed, which is, my friends, love is better than anger, hope is better than despair, optimism is better than despair. So let us be loving, hopeful, and optimistic, and we will change the world. So that's a nice way to be best known, but he needs to be known as the person who actually was the first city councillor to promote a food policy council in North America. And I was on staff for that council. And in my opinion, he's the politician, regardless of where you are in a partisan way, who first understood the nature of today's political issues. which is the old issues of politics, seatbelts, chlorinating water, fluoridation, were actually designed around, you do this one simple fix and we got the problem solved. And by and large, that strategy worked. Like seatbelts have totally dramatically reduced the number of people who die or are seriously injured in car accidents. But what he understood was we pretty well were beyond that stage of what you might call simple problems. We're into what are called now wicked problems, which are very challenging. And so if you take the first issue, he and I started a group called the Coalition for a Green Economy in 1992. That's exactly the same time he started his organization against violence against women. So I saw intimately what he was doing there, including mortgaging his house to pay for it. But he started off not by going to government, but by going to men and saying, when we're talking about violence against women, we're not talking about women committing violence against women, we're talking about men committing violence against women, and men have got to take a stand on it. So he went to prominent people in unions, entertainment, basketball, wrestling, whatever, and got them to make a statement that this was totally unacceptable. Then he went to Rotary clubs and a whole range of community-based organizations. Then he went to cities and said, you can do something as a city because the police define whether or not it's a crime or whether it's just an in-family problem. And then he went to the province and talked to them what they could do, and then he went to the feds and said, women have to have shelter so they can leave their home and still have a place to live, and their kids have a place to live. So he was the person who understood that issues require all levels of government, not one level of government, and all levels of the population at various levels. And I think that's the key thing that we need to understand about food. We cannot come to the city and say, you are going to solve this problem. It's got to be a big we are going to be solving it. The third, and I was interested to know about this city as a multicultural place. When you go to the library, you see the fur trader who discovered this from Ontario, and you also see a statue of Gandhi. And this is a picture of Gandhi leading the 1930 Salt March. And it says two things about the food movement. Number one is you got to take your own power. And so his argument was, why are we buying salt from England and paying tax on it when we're surrounded by ocean and can make our own salt? So he led a nationwide march to take your power. But in the years before, when he was training the people in civil disobedience who would join with him in this march, he said the fundamental thing for anyone who wants to join me in this march for the independence of India from Britain is that you must love Britain. You cannot participate in this march if you do not love Britain and the English people. And that's how he guaranteed that this was a movement that would not be based on hate and division, but on positive. So my way of translating that is if you want to work on food in the city of Toronto, you got to love Toronto, and if you want to work on it in the city of Edmonton, you got to love the city. You're not a critic of the city, you're a person who loves this city and wants it to be better. Last week we had a group of people, and I helped organize from Japan, who talked about how Japan dealt with the food crisis that came out of the terrible earthquake and tsunami that they had, and we took them on a tour of Food Share where this is how they make juice with a bicycle. And the point of this is that the food movement has to be about positive steps that people can take. It's not a critical movement. It's not academic in that sense or analytical. It's about people coming forward with solutions. And the rough number that you want to be thinking about comes from a book that comes from Cornell University called Mindless Eating. And the person who wrote it was trying to figure out why is it we do so many things about food without thinking. And his answer is because there are so many decisions we have to make every day. Should I have breakfast or not? Should I have toast or cereal? Should I have butter or margarine? That we can't cope with it, so we just do things by some image we saw on TV or whatever. But if you add together those 200 decisions, I would also argue that you also make every day 100 decisions that are somewhat related to the environment. Shall I have fair trade or not? Shall I buy this tomato even though it's far away, or these strawberries even though they're far away? Shall I get the stuff with this awful packaging which will take 4 million years before it starts to compost? So if you add it all together, in my opinion, we each make 300 decisions a day related to food. There's almost 1 million people in Edmonton, and that means that every day in Edmonton there are 300 million decisions being made about food. And my message is, we got a lot of room to be positive on. And we're not going to get to the whole 300 million every day, but we just got to start ticking them off. And that's the energy, I believe, behind the food movement. The fourth is that we're a big tent. And in our society, I think we're used to small tents, small silos. You're in this part of a planning department, or this part of the city, or this part of the federal government. And we need to understand that food affects, I would say, 3 areas of health we need to be concerned about: physical health, dental health, or oral health as it's called, public health, and mental health. And I would say mental health is probably the primary area where food has its biggest and most dramatic impact. And we got to have a big tent that it's not just about nutrition and the body. We got to have a big tent that it's about all departments. The garbage department or the works department of a city has as much to do with food as the nutrition or the health part of the city. And it takes all levels of government. And in my opinion, we strive to include all kinds of people. So in Toronto, for instance, we were fortunate enough to have an animal welfare group that works with local farmers to have local slaughterhouses, because the greatest amount of cruelty that is done to animals is on the long trip from the farm to the slaughterhouse, not in the slaughterhouse itself. So it doesn't mean that it's an obligation that we can only do things we all agree on, but we can strive to be inclusive. And I would say the same for organic, local, sustainable, healthy, fair trade, farmers market. We should all be working together to grow the whole pie and not be fighting among ourselves. So that's my last of my personal messages. We're on to part 2, which is, how do we think about food? And so here's a little test that you can try for yourself, which is to figure out, what can you do with this? And the answer is, will determine something about you, which is, if you think it's good for making a wall, you should be working for the federal government. You see something and you see the one silo that it fits into, right? But the key to it is called creativity, according to a book by Jonah Lehrer, is you have to think not in a convergent way, which is brick wall, but in a divergent way. Okay, so you want to think, just because I'm taking way longer than I thought I would, a brick is it's a paperweight. You put it behind your back, a tire in your car so it doesn't roll down the hill. It's a doorstop. You can use it to hold up a window. You can throw it at somebody from the federal government. You can do it. We need a long list. And when you get to about 25, then you're ready for the food movement. Okay, because our movement, our understanding of food is based on creativity or divergent thinking. So the biggest problem with food, in my opinion, is that not that people don't value good food, they can't put it high enough on the priority list. And the reason why is they don't think it's a heavy lifter. In Ontario, the auto industry was the heavy lifter. Here, oil is the heavy lifter. The number 1 industry in Ontario now, however, is food. The number 2 industry here is food. But over and above that, it's what in economic history is known as enabling technology. When they introduced the train, and the reason why the train was such a big deal in Canadian history, is it has nothing much to do, or only a little to do, with the fact that a farmer from Alberta would ship their grain from Alberta to Montreal, where it would then go to Europe. You would not want to have the whole basis of the train industry based on whether or not the train industry made money from that sale or from that transportation. because if you did not have trains, then Europeans wouldn't have come to settle the West. It was a technology that enabled the West to be settled, just like canals 70 years earlier allowed Western Ontario or Western New York, just as airplanes today enable certain things. They're not, so the argument about enabling technologies in traditional government policy was, if it's not just the business itself, but it enables whole other things, you got to think about it in a totally different way. And that's the way, in my opinion, food is fundamentally an enabling technology. And the reason for that is, when farmers start to farm, they buy things. They buy clothes, they buy tractors, they buy fuel, they buy all fertilizers, they buy all sorts of things. It's what is called backward linkages. When they finish with their crop, they sell it through all sorts of places that also create jobs. Those are called forward linkages. And when you circulate the money around, it causes another layer of job creation, which is called the multiplier effect. So food is one of the few industries that has that enabling capability. And if you look at the city of Toronto, and I think the numbers would be different, but the concept isn't different. We have a huge sector called the creative sector. About 40,000 people work in the film industry, and about 200,000 students study in post-secondary education. What's one thing they all have in common? All students work in food places while they're going to school, and all actors work in the food industry when they're unemployed. Right? You cannot. And I went to a great restaurant where I tried that apricot beer last night, a fusion Chinese restaurant, and our waitress, bless her, was an actress. So you can't have a creative sector unless you got a vibrant food sector. It is an enabling sector of the economy. So the second thing, some of you may remember phone booths, I'm not sure, is that it is a relationship technology. So I was just talking to the councillor before, and he represents an area with a lot of newcomers. Food is the way you bring them together. You have what's called a progressive party. That is, you start off at one house and you have drinks, you move on to another one and have appetizers, and then the main course, then dessert, and then a final roll of drinks, and then you walk, not drive, home. So you get progressively more drunk. And so that we did that on our street, and it's what turned our street into a real neighborhood. Community gardens can be designed to build neighborhoods, and I'll talk about that in a bit. When people want to do a business deal, they usually have a business lunch. They break bread. The word companion comes from the Latin from com, meaning with, and pane, bread. So the whole history of food is not about eating alone, it's about eating in families, which is another relationship technology. So as with enabling technology, there's a second way in which food is fundamental. It's over and above its importance just to fill your tummy or put nutrients into it. And the third way is what the Europeans call multifunctional agriculture. I call it the Swiss Army knife of city policy. And what the Europeans, especially the French, discovered was that they did not want to have their farmers hanging on the thread of whether or not we would pay the right price for their strawberries, because the main industry of France is tourism, and the main reason tourists come to France is to eat their food. And so then they realized farmers are not only important because they are the base of our tourism industry, the number one industry in the country, they also maintain heritage in the countryside. They also keep people in the countryside so that they can make sure it's safe and remains French. They also keep people in the countryside instead of coming into the cities, which are overcrowded. So when they think about food policy in Europe, this is why they're head and shoulders above us, is they think about food and farming as having many functions, not just one. And I think that's sort of the beginning of where we want to go, pardon me. This is the rooftop of the St. Louis Children's Hospital. And it's, just want to make not quite the rooftop, but one rooftop. And just above it is children who are getting chemotherapy treatment for cancer. So as a mental health thing, they wanted thing for those kids to be able to look out on with something as beautiful as that and not tar. And Grand River Hospital in Ontario does the same thing. And hospitals that have made their grounds look beautiful have found that they discharge people in 3 days instead of 4. That's the kind of savings that they make from introducing nature or urban agriculture into their scene. So we need to think very broadly when we're trying to talk about the functions of it. This is Edmonton, and when we talk about local food, we tend to have a fairly narrow view of it in North America, which is that it's food that was farmed fairly close to here. In Europe, they're actually more often, in other parts of the world as well, Asia, they refer to what is they call it local food. I call it food of locality. That is a food that could only come from here. Okay, and so you know when certain kinds of cheeses are named after the area they came from in France, certain wines are named after the area they came from. And the people I met from Japan last week in Kyoto, there are 41 foods that come from Kyoto. And so what festivals should do is to create foods of locality in Hamilton, and in Hamilton, in Edmonton. So, you know, when you're having your pancake breakfast, it should be with red fife wheat, which a woman named Sharon Rempel introduced back into Edmonton when I was here in the 90s. This was the wheat that settled the Canadian West, and she got the Ukrainian Museum on the outskirts of town to pioneer it. And this is what the people who went up to the Klondike would have eaten. So let's make that the heritage pancake of the Yukon days. And these are things that you can start to develop to really drive home the special flavor of the city. This is a community garden in a low-income, high-immigrant area in the north of Toronto. And it's situated on the grounds of a Lutheran church from the period when it was mainly Europeans who were there. Now it's mostly people from the Caribbean and Asia. And they had quite a debate in the church about whether or not to allow a community garden, which they thought sounded a little too secular in their grounds, and about having people who weren't Lutheran using those grounds. And but it became a huge success. And this is a family that was there about a year ago, where the young boy that was brought, totally homesick, missing his friends, and this is where his mother got him to sort of transition, to transplant into North America. And the leader of the opposition to having the community garden last fall, after the minister finished his sermon, stood up and said, "I want to thank God for giving us this community garden. It is the best thing we have ever done." So this is what food can do for cities. You know, parents always say that their kids don't know where food comes from. The kids think food comes from a store. But the parents don't stop to think that they don't know where food comes from either, because they think it comes from a farm. It comes from nature and labor. And so we need, you know, in some cities they're actually pioneering urban orchards of edible forests. And that's the thing that we could possibly do here. But part of it is for beauty and part of it is for food. Canada is the only country besides Ireland in the OECD that does not have a national school meal program. We can take advantage of being late, I believe, by saying we don't only want food, we want quality food, local, sustainable, and quality food, and we want a food curriculum so that kids learn up to grow up with basic food skills and knowledge of food. And this is a big area that's developing, and means that at the city level, it's also part of education. Most of us have a habit of thinking of ourselves as powerless, and I think what food teaches us is to see ourselves as having power. And this is the University of Toronto. It's the largest campus in North America. It's also the largest site of a local and sustainable food project in the world. And my wife, Lori Stahlbrand, set it up in an organization called Local Food Plus. And what it tries to do is to use local food purchasing policy to promote the goals of local and sustainable agriculture. And they use the principle known as continuous improvement, which is the first year you do 10%, the second year you do 20, the third year you do, or the second year you do 15, third you do 20. They're now heading to 25%. So this is a whole new concept of how we can move agendas. One of the poverty and food go together by and large in terms of food producers, and the amazing thing about it is how simple it is to solve. These are farmers from a small town in Florida called Immokalee, which is the tomato capital of North America. If you have a commercial tomato, it is from here. If you have a fast food tomato, it is from here. They realized they could not go on strike against the tomato owners or the tomato farm owners because the price was kept low by the fast food industry that was ordering them. So they launched a series of boycotts against the big first fast food companies. They've gone through about all of the fast food companies and 2 major government service companies now. And here's their demand, is they make on average $10,000 a year, okay, and no medical care. Is that 1 cent additional be paid for a pound of tomatoes to go to the salary of the workers, and a half a cent be paid to go for a health care plan. 1.5 cents per tomato. Now you think in terms of a slice, there's probably minimum 5-6 slices. So it's not even 1/4 cent. And they improve their living standards by 60%. Okay, so in food, you do not have to change the whole world to make life a heck of a lot better. And it's the same ratio with fair trade coffee. 1 cent a pound makes a world of difference. This is a guy, a young guy. I call him my mentor. He calls me his mentor. So neither of us actually know what a mentor is. So, but I went with him to Mexico last year, and we have a direct fair trade agreement between Toronto and this small village in the mountains of Mexico. And so it's a personal relationship. But what the term he introduced me to, which I really love, is called actionism. And he distinguishes activism and actionism. He's not against activism, but activism is you're going after the government to make sure they do something that they're not doing. You are protesting. And actionism is you are doing it, you are showing it, you are doing a demonstration project, not just a demonstration protest. And his argument is that food is very suited to actionism. Yesterday, I and a group of planters went down to see the Leduc plant where they help farmers commercialize processing. And I got the figures on how jobs, farming, and processing and the like go together. So here's a back of the envelope calculation. In Alberta, you produce $10 billion worth of agricultural commodities, and you have $10 billion worth of work on processing those commodities. In Ontario, where we mostly sell our food elsewhere and buy our food from elsewhere, we do, for every $10 billion of commodity, we have $30 million of processing. So there's a big jump. In the city of Toronto, where I work, we argue for every $10 billion of processing, we would like to see $50 billion of processing, preparation, warehousing, billing. Okay, this is the motor force of economic development. It's why food can step up to replace auto in Ontario, and why in the event of a downturn of oil here, you can use food. This is a new form of agriculture called SPIN, small places, intensive agriculture. So you see how small the place is at top? Still small in the bottom. But it's scientifically farmed. There's nothing there that goes cheap. There's no potatoes. There's heirloom tomatoes, heirloom garlic, whatever you can get $2 a bulb for, or whatever, and it's sold at a farmer's market. And the founder of this movement, Wally Saskowitz from Saskatoon, has spread it across North America. good to hear there's a Saskatoon spirit. And he farms right in Saskatoon on about 4 or 5 people's backyards. And he and his wife make about $45,000 a year, some of which they spend in Saskatoon and some of which they spend down south when they're holidaying all winter. So this is a thing a lot of young people are interested in. This is a bunch of young hippies and, elitist members of the community gardening set. And that's the first community garden in Toronto in the 1980s. If you know the background there, that's in Regent Park, the largest low-cost housing project in North America. And when we talk about food and what it brings community-wise, we want to distinguish between 2 kinds of community benefit. And it creates what is called in economics social capital. Just you have financial capital and you have the capital from the wealth of your social relations. And there's 2 kinds of social capital. This is called bonding. So what you have here are a group of Chinese seniors who have a couple of things in common. They're Chinese and they're seniors. They like to talk about old things. They like to talk about being sore everywhere, all the things that people who are older like to talk about. And and what they are doing is using the garden as a chance to come together. And the opposite of that is called a bridging garden, which is deliberately set between 2 neighborhoods so people will meet each other as equals. So we're now establishing community gardens between the well-to-do area of Cabbagetown and this area, so people meet each other not as, you got a problem, you're poor, I'm not, but we're all equal gardeners. So 2 kinds of social capital that food contributes. The main message is empowerment, in my opinion. This is from the psychiatric hospital in Toronto, where we established a community garden, an organic garden, mainly because people with psychiatric disabilities don't want to be taking any risk whatsoever with toxic materials. And these are people who have not worked for 10 years, and they're on selling their stuff for the first time, and they are so pumped. And this is really the message of what food can bring, is incredible levels of empowerment. And just to get a sense of how that empowerment can translate into strategy, if you want a number. If 10,000 people spent $10 a week on local and sustainable food, so $10 a week is not a lot more. If you paid 1 to 5% more, it's a pretty small amount. If 10,000 people bought $10 a week, it's the same as taking 1,000 cars off the road. 1,000 cars off the road. Can you imagine what it would take to get 1,000 people to give up their car? But you can do the same with that kind of a simple act. And that's what food is about. Part 3. How's my time? Okay. So I went on a tour with, Toronto, as any of you who went there before it became amalgamated would know, is totally, Toronto the good, totally obsessed with cleanliness. And so there was a department called Clean and Green in the city of Toronto, and they were supposed to be in charge of, putting people in jail who littered, and that kind of thing. So for some reason, the head of the Clean and Green department came on a tour with me of projects in low-income areas of the city. And at the end of the day, she came to the conclusion that if people feel that they own an area, they will keep it clean and green. And if they do not feel they own it, they will not. And it's as simple as that. And so when she came back, she became the chief funder of the community gardens. My budget for supporting community gardens was 0. And she had the budget. These are on every bus stop in the city of Toronto after we finished the tour, to come and buy food at farmers markets and parks. So if you feel that you own it and you're part of it, you will keep it clean and green. And we don't have to arrest anybody. I have city staff picking up after it. People will do it themselves. What this demonstrates is the principle of leverage. And this is the main thing. It actually took me 10 years until I retired before I learned this. I don't have to ask somebody in the works department to help me do my public health thing. I don't have to ask somebody in the recreation department to help me do something with food. I need to help them understand how they can use food as a lever to do what they need to do more effectively and cheaper than they've done it before. And that is the real secret to how food works. So when we put the food strategy through the City of Toronto, it simply had one statement from the city manager that required directors, which in Toronto is the highest person in the department, in their annual report to say, answer this question, what have you done to use food for leverage? That's all, and it's starting to spread. When we talk about local food, we think of how far from the food, from the farmer to your stomach, which is, I would argue, the smallest distance that any food has traveled. When you got to add how long was it from the fertilizer, probably from here to California. How far was it from the plastic container, probably from here to Sarnia to California. And you put all those distances together. There's about 15 major trips. In Toronto, the last trip is here from Toronto to China, where it will be recycled as an environmentally positive act. So you're starting to really move on that, but we need to think, when we're thinking about local food, exactly how complicated and multi-sided it is. Again, this city is moving on compost, and that's a fantastic way to deal with a resource. As you know, in nature, there is no waste. There's just another person or process to use it, and that's what we do when we compost. And I was glad to hear Jim mention about water. So here you see a classic situation of irrigation. About 1/3 of the water is going up in evaporation. It's not hitting the crop. And B, there's as much water between the plants as in it. So that's going to be great for the dandelions that settle there, right? So there's a lot of things wrong with that picture. And what we need, I believe we can do is, unfortunately, because of the way governments are organized, water departments and food departments are never together. They don't even talk to each other. But we need to be saying, what do you do with gray water, which is, after all, full of little bits of stuff from you rinsed out your can of tomatoes, and soap, which is great, made of phosphates, that can be gray water and used to grow food. And how do we keep it out of the sewage system? How do we keep rainwater out of the sewage system by using it with rain barrels? So we have as you know, the biggest controversy of this century is not going to be oil, it's going to be water, and we can do a lot about it and help food at the same time at the city level. And if you want to talk about rooftop gardens, which I hope you do, you can't even name how many benefits there are from a rooftop garden. The first, when we started this campaign on this, which was 15 years ago, we convinced Central Mortgage and Housing to do a study, and they did a thing called Green Roofs Make Healthy Cities. And every S, they put a $sign through it, because the city pays for any cost of green roofs. If the city had to make the green roofs, which you don't have to, you can just order the developer to do it, by keeping rain out of the stormwater. And you also, if you have plants that absorb the stuff, they take in the rainwater and then they give it off on a hot day and they cool the city. The main reason why cities are insufferably hot during the summer is because black on pavement attracts and stores it, and cement holds it in. And if you look over the last 30 years, you'll see that the heat in the evening was much cooler 15 years ago than it is now, because there's more cement and pavement holding it in. But when you got plants, they're giving off water, and they can actually, when it's like when you walk into a forest, it's about 5 degrees cooler. It's the same on the top of a good green roof. It's a new recreation space. It's a place for people to take a look at the city. Restaurants love it. And Jim mentioned Royal York Hotel. I mean, they get more TV programs and free advertising about their rooftop garden than they do about anything. So, vacant space. There's vacant space. There's no city that doesn't have vacant space. And And that's, whenever you have vacant space, it's at risk for some kind of behavior that you would prefer not to have, a drug trade or whatever. So here it is in the west end of Toronto. Here it is about a month and a half later, after Greenest City worked with a group of at-risk kids, okay, heading for reform school. They had the funding to turn that into a garden. And as you know, if you're working with people, Hanny, one of the planners here, is a social worker, the last stage before healing is that you have to give back to the community. And so here they are, they've grown a garden, integrated it into art and food, and now they're sharing the skills with young kids. So this is what can happen with vacant space, a totally unused resource and vacant space in terms of kids or at-risk kids. Bindale Collegiate, near where I was born, there was a shooting there 2 years ago, and the principal called Food Share, which I'm on the board of, and said, we want to do something with food. So like many schools, it was built on what used to be farmland. Now they got a farm there again. And there has not been a violent incident at the school since that program was started. When we stopped the use of pesticides and herbicides in Toronto parks, they didn't know what to do with the greenhouse where they grew plants that mainly needed pesticides and herbicides. And so Solomon Boye from Ghana, Toronto's master gardener, opened it up as a season extension that takes no heat in the greenhouse. And 300 yards from him is a community of mostly people on low income from Thailand and the Caribbean. And they use this garden to grow food by using season extension methods, no artificial heat. And you would be amazed at how much food, like you have not necessarily the longest summer, but you got some of the longest days in summer. Like just think in terms of what are your assets and how you can flip them. Botswana had the highest rate of AIDS in the world. Toronto had a very high rate of AIDS and had a very positive program to deal with it. And we set up a program to invite them over to see what we had done. And one of the ways we introduced them to was community gardening. And the unfortunate reality is when one parent got AIDS in Botswana, 2 parents got AIDS, and when 2 parents got AIDS, you had 2 orphans coming soon. So the community gardening program was established to teach youth, A, to help them heal, and B, so they could make an income. So you can become internationally connected as a city and give back to the world. There you just get a sense of, you know what, somebody's stuck up in their apartment all day, and the city can help deal with not just public safety in the case of Bendale, but isolation through farmers markets. All cities are aging. They say there's a tsunami of old people like me coming on the scene. And you know what? Our cities were not built for elderly people. They were not built for people who are too old to drive, can't afford to drive. And we got to rethink. And that means we got to rethink how food will be, because people aren't going to be able to go to super centers. We got to have a whole new rethink. Got to rethink, not just get that brick is only for one thing. We got pools in every city all across the cities. They're only used part of the year, right? Because they're too cold to swim in the winter, except for here. And so somebody who runs a community center said, well, we can use it for fishing. So they got a gone fishing program, and you can introduce people who normally, in this case, it's people on low income from immigrant communities, people with physical disabilities. And right now, in this community health center, they hire kids who just got out of reform school to work in the kitchen selling food. And when you order fish, they say, well, go down and get one. So, and we can use this food to develop good relations with the farming community, which are very much in need. I believe the big divide in Canada is between rural and urban, and we need to work at healing it. And here's a fantastic couple. We're raising tobacco, and they now raise these Texas Longhorns, and they have 50 revenue streams on this farm. Okay, only one of them is from selling the meat big fans in the city of Toronto. But they also get money from birders, and they get money from local utilities for turning the water over to them cleaner than when it came through their farm. This is where I discovered how powerful and smart McDonald's was, is that we had a campaign to use city facilities on World Food Day to introduce elementary school students to food. And so I dressed up as a carrot. And I'd never been so popular in my whole life. And people were, because I'm addicted to coffee, so you normally don't see me except with a coffee thing. Some kids are coming up to me saying, "You're not a carrot. Carrots don't drink coffee." And but I just said, this is what McDonald's has done with a clown, right? And so we need to make food fun too. And so the rule of getting in this, for any NGO that wanted to get in, I said, the only rule is this: no literature. It's got to be fun and it's got to be interactive. And it was a real sellout crowd. And you just fix it so that it's part of the curriculum that the teacher's supposed to be in, and you can turn it in. Nudge is the big area where cities need to move. Right now, corporations have unrestricted access to young people. I mean under 12, I mean under 2. And they're not selling the nutrition of the food, they're selling the toy that goes with it. And cities, as people who are responsible for design, layout, city planning, what can be located, have some rights, and I would argue responsibilities to say, you know what, near a school, we don't let porn shops and we don't let junk food. We want good food near schools. Just like with tobacco, we've done it all with tobacco. No one says you can't smoke. You just can't smoke at work because you endanger someone. You can't smoke in buildings. You can't get cigarettes from a vending machine in the schools or in a hospital. And we need to use some of this, what is called architectural choice stuff at the city level. And part of it is positive, as you're doing fantastically with these food trucks, and I hope we can follow you on that. And I would say the deal is you can use this low-cost way to move food, which we're happy because it encourages entrepreneurs, but you got to give us something too. We want to see your fair share of local, sustainable, and healthy food on that truck. This is my poor secretary who worked with me. I want to tell you that to do this job, you just need to be in good spirit, and one person can do it. It's a very lean operation for a city to move on. This is me the day I retired. About 5 councillors broke into the room and gave me these 2 chickens, which are illegal. So that's Chicken Joe on the far right. And he said, "Wayne, you began your life in civil disobedience, and so it must end." Thank you very much.